The media tried to write off ShedeurSanders before he even had a real chance to prove himself. But what's coming out now is flipping that entire story on its head. Because for months, fans were fed a very specific narrative. You probably saw it too. Headlines pushing quarterback battles that didn't quite make sense. Reports suggesting uncertainty. Constant comparisons. It felt like every week there was a new name being thrown into the mix, a new storyline designed to make things look unstable. And if you were paying attention, it almost seemed like Shedeur was being set up to fail before he even stepped on the field. But here, where things get interesting. Two voices just stepped in and completely shattered that version of events. G. Bush and Magdog finally sat down together, and what they revealed wasn't just another opinion. It felt like a curtain being pulled back. Suddenly, the noise didn't sound like noise anymore. It sounded like something else entirely. According to what's being discussed, a lot of that off-season chaos may not have been real competition at all. Let that sink in. The constant chatter about other quarterbacks stepping in, the idea that Shedeur was just another name in a crowded room, the suggestion that he wasn't ready. All of it starts to look very different when you hear insiders question how those stories even got traction in the first place. There's growing buzz online, with fans speculating that certain narratives were being pushed intentionally, shaping perception before reality ever had a chance to speak. And if that's even partially true, it changes everything. Because now this isn't just about a rookie quarterback trying to earn his spot. This becomes a story about control, who controls the narrative, who benefits from the doubt, and what really happens behind closed doors when the cameras aren't rolling. What makes this even more intense is how confident these takes are. No hesitation, no sugarcoating, just straight up calling out what they believe was happening while everyone else stayed quiet. And whether you agree with them or not, one thing is clear: their words are hitting a nerve across the NFL community. Fans are split right down the middle. Some are hearing this and thinking, finally, someone said it. Others are shaking their heads, wondering if this is being blown out of proportion. But either way, people are paying attention now more than ever. Because when narratives start to crack, the truth usually isn't far behind. And here's the part that should really make you lean in. If you love real talk and fearless NFL breakdowns, hit subscribe and join Coach Speaks. If Shedeur was never meant to be just another quarterback in this situation, then what was actually going on? Why did it feel like he was constantly being compared, questioned, and quietly pushed to the background? And more importantly, who stood to gain from that? Because as more pieces start coming together, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. The story we were told might not be the real story at all. The off-season didn't just feel chaotic, it was designed to feel that way. Out of nowhere, the conversation around ShedeurSanders turned into a revolving door of names, rumors, and so-called competition. One day it was Malik Willis being linked into the mix. The next, people were talking about Anthony Richardson. And somehow, even a veteran like Aaron Rodgers got pulled into the conversation. At first glance, it looked like normal NFL chatter. Teams explore options. Media speculates. Fans debate. That's how the off-season usually works. But this felt different. Because the volume of noise never slowed down. Every update seemed to contradict the last. One report would suggest a wide-open quarterback battle, while another hinted that decisions had already been made behind closed doors. It created this constant sense of uncertainty, like nobody really knew what direction things were going. And that's exactly what made it so effective. Fans started questioning everything. Was Shedeur actually ready? Was the team losing confidence? Was there a real chance he could get buried on the depth chart before even getting a fair shot? That's the picture being painted. But according to what's now being discussed, that picture may have been completely misleading. There's been growing buzz online, with many believing that a lot of this competition was more smoke than substance. Reports suggested a crowded quarterback room, but when you actually break it down, the pieces don't fully add up. The constant linking of different quarterbacks started to feel less like genuine interest, and more like a narrative being pushed to keep attention away from what was really happening. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. Because if the chaos wasn't real, then it served a purpose. It distracted. It divided attention. It kept fans and media focused on possibilities instead of reality. While everyone was busy debating which quarterback might take over, very few were asking a more important question. What was the actual plan all along? Even more telling is how consistent the messaging felt. Different outlets, different voices, but somehow the same themes kept showing up. That's what made people start raising eyebrows. Because in situations like this, repetition usually isn't random. It's coordinated, or at the very least, influenced. Now, to be clear, none of this has been officially confirmed. But the way insiders are starting to talk about it, the way fans are connecting the dots, it's hard to ignore the pattern forming in the background. And once you start seeing that pattern, the entire offseason looks different. What once felt like an unpredictable quarterback battle starts to look like controlled noise. What seemed like genuine concern starts to feel like planted doubt. And suddenly, Shedeur's situation doesn't look like a struggle to compete. It looks like a situation where perception was being shaped before performance ever had a chance to speak. But here's the twist. If all that chaos was just a smokescreen, then it raises a bigger question that nobody was asking at the time. What were they trying to hide? Because as the noise fades and the real story begins to surface, one thing becomes clear. The off-season wasn't just messy. It was calculated. And what comes next makes that even harder to ignore. Behind all the noise, there was a quieter storyline forming, and it didn't look good for ShedeurSanders. Because while fans were distracted by the so-called quarterback battle, reports started surfacing that hinted at something much more deliberate. It wasn't just about competition. It was about control, specifically who was supposed to take the lead from the very beginning. And that's where Dillon Gabriel enters the picture. According to multiple discussions and insider chatter, it was being suggested that Gabriel was already viewed as the safer option, the more ready quarterback, the one certain decision-makers were more comfortable backing early on. Not publicly, of course, but behind the scenes, that belief seemed to carry weight. At the same time, a very different plan was being linked to Shedeur. Instead of being thrown into the spotlight, the idea, at least according to what's being said, was to slow him down. Let him sit. Let him develop quietly. Some even described it as a potential redshirt approach, where he wouldn't see meaningful action right away, regardless of how he performed in camp. Think about that for a second. A quarterback coming in with this much attention, this much expectation, and the plan might have been to keep him on the sidelines. That's not just surprising. That's a completely different direction than what fans were being led to believe. And when you start connecting that with the off-season chaos, it begins to make more sense. If the narrative focuses on competition, then nobody questions why a player isn't getting opportunities. It gives cover. It buys time. It shifts attention away from any pre-decided hierarchy. Now, again, none of this has been officially confirmed. But the consistency in these reports, and the way insiders have started to hint at it, has people paying attention. Because it doesn't stop there. One of the biggest names tied to this approach is Kevin Stefanski. There's been speculation that his preference leaned toward a more traditional path, favoring stability, familiarity, and a slower developmental curve for someone like Shedeur. And in that kind of system, a player with high expectations doesn't always get immediate trust. Instead, they get patience, whether they want it or not. And that's where the tension really builds. Because from the outside, it looked like Shedeur was just another competitor trying to win a job. But from this perspective, it starts to feel like the outcome may have been leaning in a certain direction long before training camp even began. Which leads to a tough question. If he was outperforming expectations, or at least showing enough to earn real consideration, would it have even mattered? Or was he always going to be kept waiting? That's the part that has fans divided right now. Some believe this is just how teams operate, nothing unusual, just development strategy. Others see it differently. They see a talented quarterback potentially being boxed into a role he didn't earn or deserve. And just when it looked like that plan might quietly play out, something shifted. Because behind the scenes, not everyone was on the same page. And what happened next may have completely changed Shedeur's path moving forward. Just when it looked like the plan was set in stone, something shifted behind the scenes, and it changed everything for ShedeurSanders. Because while the narrative outside was still stuck on competition and development, there are strong indications that inside the building, a different conversation was happening, one that didn't fully align with the idea of keeping Shedeur on the sidelines. And that's where two powerful names come into play, Andrew Barry and Jimmy Haslam. According to growing speculation and insider discussion, these weren't just passive observers watching things unfold. Reports suggest they played a much more active role in how the quarterback situation evolved. While nothing has been officially confirmed, there's a lot of buzz pointing toward one key idea. They weren't willing to let Shedeur disappear before he even got a real shot. Think about the position they were in. A high-profile quarterback with massive expectations comes in, and early plans might limit his exposure. That's a risk, not just for the player, but for the franchise. Because if you never truly see what he can do, you're gambling with potential you can't measure. And from the way this is being talked about now, it sounds like that gamble wasn't something everyone was comfortable with. There's been talk that decisions were made, quietly but firmly, to make sure Shedeur had a clear path to prove himself. Not handed anything, not gifted a role, but given a real opportunity. The kind that forces performance to matter more than preset plans. And if that's true, it explains a lot. It explains why the narrative started to shift, why the idea of him being buried on the depth chart slowly faded, why suddenly his presence felt more central instead of optional. Because when leadership steps in, priorities change. If you love real talk and fearless NFL breakdowns, hit subscribe and join Coach Speaks. Some even believe this was a moment where internal philosophies clashed. On one side, a more cautious, controlled approach. On the other, a push to let talent speak for itself. And when those two ideas collide, something has to give. In this case, it looks like the door opened. But here, what makes this even more intense? If that intervention never happened, if things just followed the original path, there's a real chance we wouldn't even be having this conversation right now. Shedeur might have been sitting quietly, waiting for an opportunity that never came, while someone else took the spotlight. That's how close it may have been. And that's why this moment feels so important in hindsight, because it wasn't just about adjusting a depth chart. It was about changing a trajectory, a single shift that turned uncertainty into opportunity. Of course, none of this is officially confirmed, and it's important to treat it as developing insight rather than hard fact. But the consistency in how this is being discussed, the way insiders hint at it, makes it hard to ignore. Because once that path opened, everything depended on one thing. Could Shedeur actually deliver when it mattered most? And what happened next didn't just answer that question. It completely flipped the narrative. Once the opportunity finally opened up, everything came down to one thing: performance. And this is where ShedeurSanders completely flipped the script. Because up until that point, the narrative had already been shaped. Questions about readiness, doubts about whether he could handle the pressure, constant comparisons to other quarterbacks. It felt like he was walking into camp with more skepticism than support. But the moment practices started, the conversation began to change. Quietly at first, then all at once. Reports coming out of camp started telling a very different story than what fans had been hearing all off-season. Instead of struggling to keep up, Shedeur was standing out. Instead of looking overwhelmed, he looked composed. And instead of making costly mistakes, he was doing something that caught everyone's attention. He was protecting the football. According to what's been discussed, he finished camp with fewer interceptions than the other quarterbacks in the room. That alone raised eyebrows. Because in a high-pressure environment where every throw is being evaluated, Limiting mistakes is one of the fastest ways to earn trust. But it didn't stop there. He was also completing more passes, staying efficient, moving the offense, and doing it consistently enough that people inside the building couldn't ignore it anymore. The so-called QB tracker numbers only added fuel to the fire. On paper, he wasn't just competing, he was outperforming. And that's when the narrative started to crack. Because it's one thing to question a player before you've seen them. It's another thing entirely when the results start speaking for themselves. Suddenly, the idea that he needed to sit and develop didn't feel as convincing. The argument that others were clearly ahead, that started falling apart. Even more impressive was how he handled pressure. This wasn't just about stats, it was about presence. From everything being said, Shedeur didn't look rattled. He didn't force plays trying to prove a point. He stayed controlled, made smart decisions, and let the game come to him. That kind of composure, especially in a situation surrounded by noise and doubt, is what separates potential from real leadership. And people noticed. Insiders started shifting their tone. Analysts who were once cautious began acknowledging what they were seeing. Fans who had been on the fence started paying closer attention. Because when performance matches or even exceeds the hype, it forces everyone to reassess. Now, to be clear, training camp isn't the final verdict. It's not the same as game day pressure under the lights. But it's where momentum starts. It's where trust is built. And in this case, it became the turning point that changed how Shedeur was viewed inside and outside the organization. What once looked like a crowded competition started to feel more one-sided. What once felt uncertain started to feel inevitable. And the biggest takeaway, he didn't just meet expectations. He challenged the entire narrative that had been built around him. But just when it seemed like performance alone would settle the debate, something even bigger happened. Because the shift wasn't just on the field anymore. It was happening at the organizational level, and that's when everything truly changed. Just when it seemed like performance alone would settle everything, the story took another turn. And this time, it wasn't happening on the field. It was happening in the way ShedeurSanders was being talked about. Because for months, the media narrative around him had been cautious at best. You heard it everywhere. His college success, questioned. His numbers, downplayed. The system he came from, critiqued. There was always a but attached to his name. Even when he performed well, the conversation quickly shifted to what he hadn't proven yet. It created this constant sense that he needed to do more just to be taken seriously. And then, almost overnight, that tone started to change. Suddenly, the same outlets that were hesitant before began highlighting completely different aspects of his story. Instead of dismissing his background, they started embracing it. Instead of avoiding his journey, they leaned into it. And at the center of that shift was one undeniable factor, his legacy. For the first time, people weren't brushing past the fact that his father is ShedeurSanders. They weren't treating it like a footnote or something to downplay. Instead, it became part of the narrative in a positive way. The coaching, the experience, the winning mentality, all of it started being framed as an advantage rather than a question mark. That's a massive shift. Because in the NFL, perception matters just as much as performance, especially early on. And when the tone around a player changes, it usually reflects something deeper happening behind the scenes. There's been growing speculation that this wasn't just a coincidence. Some believe the organization itself played a role in reshaping how Shedeur was being presented publicly. Not in a forced way, but in a strategic one, highlighting the right moments, sharing the right stories, making sure the conversation aligned more closely with what they were seeing internally. Again, nothing officially confirmed, but the timing is hard to ignore. Because this shift didn't happen in isolation. It came right after his strong showing in camp, right after the internal momentum seemed to swing in his favor, and right when the idea of him being just another option no longer made sense. That's when the narrative flipped. And once it flipped, it didn't just adjust slightly, it moved with confidence. Now the conversation wasn't about whether he belonged. It was about how far he could go, It wasn't about competing for a role. It was about owning it. The same voices that once raised doubts were now acknowledging his potential in a completely different light. Fans picked up on it immediately. Some saw it as validation, proof that he had earned respect the hard way. Others questioned why it took so long for the tone to change in the first place. But regardless of perspective, one thing became clear. The story being told now didn't match the story from just a few months ago. And when that kind of shift happens, it usually means something bigger is unfolding. Because this wasn't just about media narratives anymore. It was about alignment. The organization, the analysts, the fans, they were all starting to see the same thing at the same time. And when that kind of unity forms around a player, it only leads to one conclusion. But that final confirmation, it came in a moment that left almost no room for debate. That final confirmation didn't come from a single quote or one headline. It came from a series of signals that all pointed in the same direction. And once you saw them together, it became hard to deny what the team was saying without actually saying it. ShedeurSanders wasn't just part of the conversation anymore. He was the conversation. It started with how the organization began presenting him publicly. The tone shifted from cautious optimism to clear confidence. Instead of treating him like a developing option, they started showcasing him like a centerpiece. His journey, his background, his mindset, everything about him was being highlighted in a way that felt intentional. And fans noticed immediately. Because this wasn't subtle. This was the kind of shift you make when you're ready to stand behind a player. The kind of messaging that signals, "This is our guy," without needing to hold a press conference to say it outright. There's been a lot of discussion around this moment, with insiders suggesting that the organization made a conscious decision to humanize Shedeur. Not just present him as a quarterback, but as a leader, a competitor, someone the fan base could connect with beyond stats and highlights. And that matters more than people realize. If you love real talk and fearless NFL breakdowns, hit subscribe and join Coach Speaks. Because once a team starts building that kind of connection between a player and the fans, it usually means they see long-term value. You don't invest in that narrative unless you believe in the outcome. At the same time, the messaging inside the football side of things seemed to align with what was happening publicly. Coaches, teammates, and internal voices began reflecting a level of trust that hadn't been there before. The hesitation, gone. The uncertainty, fading fast. And then came the real giveaway. The way his story was being told. Instead of avoiding his past, the organization leaned all the way into it. His development, his upbringing, the influence of ShedeurSanders. It wasn't framed as pressure, it was framed as preparation. As if everything he had experienced was leading to this exact moment. That's not accidental storytelling. That's positioning. And when you combine that with his performance in camp, the internal support, and the shift in media tone, it all points to the same conclusion. He wasn't being tested anymore. He was being trusted. Of course, no team is going to come out and make a dramatic declaration overnight. That's not how the league works. But in situations like this, actions speak louder than words. And every action, from how he was featured to how he was discussed, sent a clear message. This is QB1. Fans felt it too. The conversations online changed. Doubt started turning into belief. People who were once skeptical began to accept what was unfolding right in front of them. Because when everything lines up, performance, messaging, support, it becomes impossible to ignore. And just like that, the narrative completed its transformation. From questioned to confirmed. But here's the part that makes this even more interesting. This wasn't just about nomming a starting quarterback. It was about how they made it happen. Because behind this shift was a strategy, one that went far beyond just football. And once you see that strategy clearly, you realize this wasn't luck at all. Once you step back and look at everything together, it becomes clear this wasn't just a random shift. It was a calculated strategy. And at the center of it all was how the organization managed to bring everyone onto the same page around ShedeurSanders. Because one of the biggest challenges for any young quarterback isn't just proving it on the field, it's winning over the voices that shape the conversation. The media, the analysts, the longtime insiders, the old guard who have seen it all before and don't hand out praise easily. And for a while, that group wasn't fully sold. But then something changed. Instead of pushing against those voices, the organization appeared to lean into them. There's been a lot of talk that they started opening the door, giving respected figures more access, more insight, more opportunities to actually see who Shedeur is beyond the surface. Names like Mary Kay Cabot and Jason Lloyd started being part of the conversation in a different way. Not just reporting from a distance, but engaging with the evolving story. And when trusted voices begin to shift their tone, it carries weight. Because fans listen to them. At the same time, something equally powerful was happening on the other side. The new generation, the fans, the younger audience, the social media wave, was already fully behind Shedeur. They didn't need convincing. They saw the confidence, the style, the presence. To them, he already felt like a franchise quarterback. So now you have two worlds forming. One that needed proof, and one that already believed. The strategy, bring them together. And that's exactly what started to happen. As the old guard began softening their stance, acknowledging his performance, recognizing his composure, the gap between skepticism and belief started to close. Meanwhile, the energy from the younger fan base kept building, amplifying every positive sign, every highlight, every moment that reinforced the idea that Shedeur was the future. It created momentum from both directions, top down and bottom up. And when those two forces meet, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop. What makes this even more effective is that it didn't feel forced. It wasn't like a sudden, obvious campaign. It felt natural, organic, like everyone was arriving at the same conclusion on their own. But when you look closely, the timing is almost too perfect. The improved access, the shifting narratives, the alignment between media, fans, and internal messaging, it all points to a coordinated effort to stabilize the story and build confidence around one central figure. And it worked. Because now, instead of debates about who should start, the conversation has evolved into something completely different. It's about how far he can take them, what this team can become with him leading it, whether this is finally the turning point fans have been waiting for. That doesn't happen by accident. That's strategy. And the biggest takeaway: this wasn't just about helping a quarterback succeed. It was about building an environment where success becomes the expectation. Which leads to the final piece of the puzzle. What this all means going forward, and why the rest of the league might not be ready for what's coming next. When you put all the pieces together, the picture becomes impossible to ignore. What started as doubt, noise, and confusion around ShedeurSanders has turned into something completely different, something far more dangerous for the rest of the league. Because this wasn't just a player fighting for a position. This was a narrative being built, challenged, and then completely rewritten. From the outside, it looked like chaos, rumors, competition, uncertainty. But as more details surfaced, it started to feel like a carefully controlled situation, one where perception didn't always match reality. Questions were raised, doubts were amplified, and for a moment it genuinely looked like Shedeur might get lost in the shuffle. But that's not how the story ended. Instead, every obstacle became part of the setup for something bigger. The supposed competition, it pushed attention away while things developed behind the scenes. The early doubts, they made his performance hit even harder when he delivered. The hesitation from media voices, it made the eventual shift feel undeniable when they finally came around. And through all of it, one thing stayed consistent. When given the chance, he showed up. That's what changed everything. Not the rumors, not the speculation, not even the internal politics people are now talking about. It was the performance, the composure, and the ability to stay locked in while everything around him felt uncertain. That's what forced the conversation to change. And once it changed, it didn't go back. Now, instead of asking whether he belongs, people are starting to ask how far he can go. Instead of debating if he's ready, the focus is shifting to what he might become with the right system behind him. That's a completely different level of expectation, and it's one that doesn't happen unless something real is there. But here, where it gets even more interesting. Because this isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning. There's still pressure, still critics, still people waiting for things to fall apart so they can say, "We told you so." That never goes away, especially at this level. And the real test hasn't even fully arrived yet. Game days, big moments, high-stakes situations where everything is on the line. That's where legacies are built, or broken. But based on everything we've seen so far, everything that's been revealed, and everything that's shifted behind the scenes, it feels like Shedeur isn't just prepared for that moment. He's built for it. And if that turns out to be true, then what we're watching right now isn't just a young quarterback finding his footing. It's the early stages of something much bigger. A takeover that nobody saw coming. A future that's being shaped in real time. So the real question is whether ShedeurSanders is QB1 anymore. It's this. Is the league ready for what happens next?
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and lets us know you love this kind of content. And hey, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends, your group chats, or anyone who loves football as much as you do. The more the conversation spreads, the better it gets. Most importantly, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss when we drop fresh stories, wild rumors, or breaking updates that the mainstream media won't talk about.